All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Megan Hotelling, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Manager for Aquifer. We're on a platform that you may be unfamiliar with. To give you the best experience possible, we encourage you to engage in the chat and post your questions in the Q&A. To activate closed captioning from your computer, click on the up arrow next to the microphone and slide the toggle on. If you're logging in from your phone, click on the small keyboard button next to the emoji icons along the bottom of your screen. If you need to increase the size of the slides, you can do so on your own screen by hovering your mouse over the top right-hand corner of the slides and clicking on the plus sign. I'd like to introduce our presenters, Joe Miller and Nicole Frischke. As Aquifer's Curriculum Integration Specialist, Joe supports programs and educators to use Aquifer's content more effectively. In this series of webinars, he will talk about our new formative assessment system, Calibrate, and how that can be used with coaching to improve student learning. Nicole Frischke is an assistant clinical professor at Northern Arizona University, where she serves as the clinical coordinator for the physician assistant program. She has been a PA since 2007, specializing in burn surgery, intensive care, and urgent care, and was a member of the Aquifer PA Task Force and is a current member of the Aquifer Peer Trainers. And I'd now like to turn it over to Joe Miller.
Thank you, Megan. We always like to start by noting that we really appreciate you being with us today because we know what it takes to take an hour out of your schedule to show up for a webinar. And we know this mostly because we also have busy schedules, but because we have asked educators, what are the barriers to most effectively use Aquifer's tools? And the top two barriers they always cite are a need for more time to use Aquifer in the packed curriculum and a lack of time for them to personally learn how to use the tools. So we really appreciate you making this time today to attend this webinar on formative assessment. We aim to ensure that you leave today with a better understanding of formative assessment in general, but also aim to ensure that you leave with additional understanding of how Calibrate is designed and how it can be used as a formative assessment. But before we dive in, let's take a quick poll. And this poll, Megan's going to put it on the screen, I think, or oh, let's see, Megan, do they have to click the little Slido down there in the corner? Is that how this works? Okay, so there's a little button that looks like it's a green S, maybe in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. And if you click on that, there's a poll, and it's what is your biggest barrier to using formative assessment tools effectively? And we've listed 4 options on there, and so we're going to give you a few seconds to get that. I think if I click on it, maybe Megan, you can tell me how things are going.
Just to confirm, you're seeing it, right, on your screen?
I can see it on the right-hand side, yes.
Okay. Okay. Oh, here come the answers. All right. You let me know when you're ready for me to share the results.
Okay. How are we doing with numbers?
We have 14 responses right now.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and share the results?
Let's see. Are you seeing it? I think you have to answer as well in order to be able to see it, perhaps.
Answer as well. All right.
Is it showing? If not, I can read it.
No, it doesn't show. Boo.
All right, hang on.
All right, for everybody that's on this webinar, we were trying this new polling system, and we tested it the other day.
We did.
We tested it, but apparently not.
Okay, so the highest response of 44%, the answer is limited understanding or training on the tools. And then tied, we have lack of time to implement or analyze results and difficulty integrating tools into the existing curriculum at 38%. And then at 6%, insufficient institutional support or resources.
Oh, that's great. Actually, because for the most part, we can't address your institutional support, but the other 3 areas we have some reasonably good answers to solutions. So I think we can help out on the other ones. So that's great. Thanks for doing that, Megan. All right. So at Aquifer, oh, it just showed up on my screen right now. That's really cool. At Aquifer, we aim to transform health professions education, resulting in safer and more effective patient care. Effective formative assessment is needed to transform health professions education. And just before we jump into that, going off of the poll a little bit, I just want you to take a moment and reflect about how you're using formative assessment today or in the last couple of months. And go ahead and feel free to share your experience in the chat so that other folks can see. And while you guys are adding those things to the chat, I'll talk about the structure of today's webinar. So we're going to break this into 3 parts, really 2 parts with a Q&A. So the first part, we're going to talk about formative assessment and pitfalls. And this is really talking about what makes formative assessment effective or the common pitfalls that can undermine its impact. We've all heard formative assessment is an effective way to impact learning, but we need to be careful to avoid these pitfalls. So Nicole's going to talk about formative assessment and then the pitfalls. And then we'll introduce Calibrate. So I'll provide an overview of Aquifer's new formative assessment product called Calibrate. It's a system we designed specifically to try to avoid these pitfalls. And we're going to talk about these key features and how we believe it empowers student learning. And then we're going to have this Q&A at the end with an early adopter. And Nicole really was an early adopter. She participated in the pilot way back in February and has some experience going back to the early stages. And so we really want this opportunity for her to give you an unblemished answer to the questions you may have about how it works with students and what some of the barriers are. So feel free to ask questions at any time. We have a chat and Q&A at the lower right where you can add your questions, or you can come on at the end and ask your questions. And just a quick overview. Aquifer is a unique nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to advancing health professions education through virtual teaching and learning. And it was founded way back in 2000 by health professions educators. And one of those educators is still the CEO today. Her name's Leslie Fall. She's a pediatrician. And the goal was really to provide students with consistent access to patients and expert preceptors through virtual cases. So one of the things they saw was that students were getting unequal access, some depending on the time of year that students went out on their clerkship rotations. They might only be giving vaccinations or doing well child checks, or they might only be seeing children with RSV, and they got a grant to start to build these virtual cases. And since 2000, they've built up to, we believe we now have 217 virtual cases across many, many courses, including pediatrics, neurology, social determinants of health, palliative care, radiology, internal medicine, family medicine, and a few others. The key to this is that Aquifer's cases walk through patient encounters step by step, with questions to engage the learners in this process. They follow an intentional pedagogy intended to mimic a patient encounter and the clinical reasoning that these interactions demand. So you have history and physical, then you have further workup or differential diagnosis, further workup, management, and so forth. And sometimes there's follow-up a lot of time later, up to a year later. Well, Aquifer started with cases. It is evolving into a holistic learning system. So the goal was always to have a learning system where students could do what they needed to advance their clinical decision-making. And this reflects the recognition and need for assessments with content. And when we think about the system, this is a little bit of the way we design it. There's 2 big circles on here. One's our content, and the other is assessment. So for Aquifer to achieve our goal of a holistic system where the results of assessment reveal targeted learning opportunities, we must intentionally connect assessment and content. We need assessment that supports insights and generates useful feedback regarding clinical readiness and overall cognitive competence. Students should be able to answer questions about whether they should complete cases for areas of clinical reasoning where they are struggling, or in cases where their reasoning is strong, maybe they can skip those cases and focus their energy on clinical experiences that will be more meaningful. We want formative assessment that reveals what students know and where their gaps persist. And this is why Aquifer designed Calibrate as a formative assessment, intended to inform students and catalyze growth, to round out our holistic system. And now I am pleased to hand over the presentation to my colleague, Nicole, who will delve into the critical role of formative assessment. And when I say colleague, Nicole and I are colleagues because she's a member of the peer trainer team, which is a volunteer group of educators that support programs in providing training and curricular consults. And we've been doing this off, I guess, 2 years now. I've known Nicole, but she's going to enlighten us on the significance of this approach and guide us through the key pitfalls, ensuring that if we avoid these, we can maximize the effectiveness of formative assessment. So Nicole.
Thank you, Joe. Because Calibrate, Aquifer's formative assessment, was designed to promote self-directed learning and avoid some of the common pitfalls that undermine the impact of formative assessment, I think it makes sense to consider what exactly formative assessment is. Let's begin by acknowledging that one of the contexts in which we discuss the importance of formative assessment is accreditation. It is essential to demonstrate that formative assessment is being used in most accreditation systems, while accrediting bodies that cover allopathic medical schools, osteopathic medical schools, PA programs, nurse practitioner programs. These accrediting bodies emphasize the importance of formative assessment in their standards. Nurse practitioners also mention it in the report on quality nurse practitioner education. Many of the attendees at this webinar will recognize the quote from the LCME standards. The Medical Schools Curricular Governance Committee ensures that each medical student is assessed and provided with formative feedback early and during each required course or clerkship to allow sufficient time for remediation. Formal feedback occurs at least the midpoint of the course or clerkship. And because of this, formative assessment is associated with mid-clerkship feedback for remediation. This is something that's similar in PA education, and beyond having to obtain it for accreditation purposes, it can be an important formative tool, helping students to identify areas of weakness earlier in the clinical setting. Students work through the remainder of the rotation able to focus on making improvements and hopefully seeing increases in their summative evaluation scores. In my program, we have the student complete the mid-rotation feedback alongside their clinical preceptor with the goal of creating an environment where open discussion facilitates identification of both strengths and weaknesses in the clinical space, and where specific constructive feedback is given and hopefully acted on by the student to improve their subsequent performance. When done thoughtfully, formative assessment can catalyze growth and development, reducing uncertainty and enabling focused, efficient gains in skills and knowledge. For formative assessment to have this impact, it generally must have the following key characteristics. First, it has to be low stakes. And by doing so, it avoids being used for judgment. If we keep it low stakes, the students are less likely to be concerned about the grade they're getting and be more interested in the quality of the feedback they're getting. It also focuses on feedback to improve mastery skills and attitudes. And lastly, empowers self-regulation and reflection. Given these three characteristics, we're going to launch another poll. Given these three characteristics of formative assessment, which do you think is the most challenging to implement in formative assessments? give people a chance to talk about what's the most challenging.
I'm working on putting the next one up. Sorry about that.
No problem.
It's still showing the last one.
Yep. We can skip ahead, and if it works, people can fill it out, and we can come back to it a little bit. Maybe it'll be a bit of a surprise.
Sounds great.
Thanks.
So the ultimate reason why we talk about using formative assessment is that high quality formative assessment provides information, it instills values, and inspires lifelong learning. Research has shown the impact on student learning across education settings. It looks like we've got the poll ready now, so we'll go ahead and add that in here.
How about that? Can you guys see it?
Yes, it showed up for me.
Okay. There we go. All right, we have 7 responses so far. 9. And if you're just joining us, the poll is on the bottom. It's a green circle with an S in it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop and share the results. Nicole, are you seeing them or no?
I am not.
Okay, let's see here.
So you have to, I think you might have to click on the Slido on the side.
Oh, it wants me to answer it. That's why. We'll add one more. Okay. So what we've got here is a two-way tie between being feedback focused and empowering self-regulation and reflection. It's kind of almost thirds, and then low stakes is just below that. So, you know, another thing that we want to remember when we're talking about formative assessment is that we want to avoid using it for evaluating or filtering students, because by doing that, we can really undermine the learning benefits that are there when we use formative feedback. Formative and summative assessments also need to be considered to be different if we want to encourage growth. We need to avoid assessment pitfalls that undermine the significant impact of formative assessment on learning and growth. So the first pitfall we need to be aware of is that formative assessment needs to be deployed as a system of assessment and not as an afterthought. This may seem like common sense, but the reality is that formative assessments are frequently deployed ad hoc to check in on students. In the moment assessment is valuable. It doesn't necessarily generate the students that the insight that students need. As Konosupak and colleagues noted, assessment is most useful when it's part of organized and ongoing processes rather than a set of unrelated events. Now, when I think of in the moment feedback with my students, I find that it gives me the opportunity to highlight the things that the student is doing right and give feedback regarding ways that they could improve. I think of running our suture lab just prior to clinical rotations as a good example of this. After a demo is given and a little bit of time of practice for the students to practice, I spend time rotating around the room and giving the students personalized feedback one-on-one. I could tell them things like your suturing spacing is spot on, or make sure you're holding your forceps like a pencil, or make sure you're not calling it tweezers, or don't lift your hands up above your head. All of those things that I know that their preceptors are going to give them a hard time about on clinical rotations, so that they're coming in hopefully a step above. And this is more of a formative process because they have opportunity to see, these are the things I'm doing wrong, and this is how I can improve in the future. These simple but specific tips and tricks serve them well in that clinical setting. And because you're giving them in a low stakes environment, they can retain and use that information later. And that's because it was given in a timely, in the moment manner. This organized and ongoing formative assessment system should have a few specific characteristics. We want to make sure that it is systematically translated into detailed feedback that informs students about their performance. It needs to lead to the development of specific plans for improved and supported guidance by faculty. We want to make sure that it is subject to follow through that includes students tracking their own progress and part of a continuous cycle over time. The lesson is that formative assessment should be organized as part of an ongoing process that generates feedback or information that a student can use to plan for improvement. Students should know what to expect in terms of summative and formative assessment. The second pitfall is trying to dual purpose an assessment by using it for both formative and summative evaluation. Even if an assessment is designed to provide formative feedback, the students may view it as summative if it also contributes data points towards a final grade or decision. For example, if results from a formative mid-rotation assessment also get included in the final rotation grade, students are likely to perceive it as a high-stakes summative test. This undermines the benefits of formative assessment in empowering self-directed learning. Now, returning back to the idea of giving mid-rotation feedback, for our clinical year students, the only grade assigned for that mid-rotation feedback is the fact that they turned it in. Because the evaluation score that's given on this preliminary evaluation doesn't factor into their grade, it helps to reinforce the formative nature of the assessment, giving them an opportunity to improve before the high-stakes assessment. Students are evaluated on the same points, the same clinical behaviors at the end of the rotation and the summative evaluation. And that particular evaluation does account for half of their grade. The goal is that because we're using those same markers of success, the student is able to see that, okay, I got a 70% on using the EMR. Now, at the end of the rotation, I got a 95%. The lesson is to be aware that using interim formative data points for summative outcomes changes learners' perception and response. It can prevent students from openly acknowledging and addressing knowledge gaps in addressing gaps in knowledge without fear of penalty. Keeping formative and summative assessments separate and clearly communicating the distinct purposes enables students to gain the full learning benefits from low-stakes practice tests. Our third pitfall is not considering how students perceive the assessment. Perception matters. Research shows that most assessments considered formative by educators are actually viewed as summative high-stakes tests by students. This misalignment of perceptions can hinder the benefits of formative assessment in promoting learning, motivation, and self-regulation. It misses the opportunity to foster adaptive expertise. To be effective, educators must be aware of learner perceptions and take steps to reinforce that formative assessments are for learning, not for evaluation. For example, clearly communicate upfront how the assessment will be used and what the expectations are. Emphasize that it's practice, not a grade. Follow up your findings with feedback and coaching. When learners view practice tests as truly low stakes formative exercises, they can fully realize their learning benefits. Our fourth pitfall is failing to engage learners as active participants in the formative assessment process. In some cases, students expect to be the passive receivers of information, wanting to be told exactly what to do next. We know as educators that we are trying to teach them to be critical thinkers. And at some point, we want them to be able to tell us what needs to be done next. Likewise, educators may believe that it's their responsibility to analyze results and tell students how to improve. However, to maximize the learning benefits, students must take an active role in formative assessment. They need to be empowered to self-analyze their performance, identifying gaps in knowledge, and determine how to improve. This develops critical self-assessment and adaptive learning skills. Rather than being passive recipients, learners become agents of their own development. By avoiding the pitfalls of passive participation, formative assessment enables learners to calibrate their activities and chart their path forward. The final pitfall is not being mindful of how educators engage with students around formative assessment results. Research show that how our faculty approaches discussions of results significantly impacts whether an assessment feels low stakes to the students. Educators who dominate the conversation, emphasize their expertise, and tell students what to do are more likely to undermine the formative nature. Well, going back to our mid-rotation feedback example, in our program, our preceptors are the ones who provide the mid-rotation feedback in concert with the student. Although the preceptor is providing the feedback, all submitted feedback for the 60 students enrolled in our program is individually reviewed by program faculty. When we see low evaluation scores or specific comments that regard clinical knowledge or professional behavior, the clinical faculty will meet with that student to get their impression of how things are going. We focus on asking open-ended questions and doing more listening than speaking, emphasizing the need to understand the student experience so our remediation techniques can be deployed if needed to allow the student to make appropriate improvements prior to the summative assessment. If necessary, we will meet with the clinical preceptor separately to obtain more information and insight. What we need to do as faculty to avoid this pitfall is to focus on a trusting co-inquiry approach guided by the student's self-analysis. Avoiding a position of dominance creates psychological safety for students to reflect on gaps without fear of judgment openly. In summary, effective formative feedback depends on occurring regularly, not just ad hoc, and not only occurring regularly, but occurring in a timely manner, communicating purpose clearly, understanding learner perception, fostering active student participation, and using thoughtful educator facilitation, not dominance. By avoiding these pitfalls, programs can fully leverage formative assessment benefits for self-directed lifelong learning. I realize that that's a lot. So we've prepared a handout, and I think Megan will drop that into the chat. You can use this handout to review some of the behaviors discussed that are associated with formative assessment. Formative assessment can significantly impact learning. And during the discussion of pitfalls that will undermine the impact of formative assessment, the need for adaptive expertise is brought up. Adaptive expertise is defined as the ability to efficiently apply foundational knowledge to solve everyday problems while innovating solutions for novel situations. This is also known as becoming a master adaptive learner, utilizing metacognitive, self-regulated learning to develop adaptive clinical expertise. But why does this matter now? It matters because medical knowledge is rapidly expanding. A 2011 study estimated the doubling rate was every 7 years, and by 2020, potentially every 73 days. Clinical practice requires constant adaptation to novel disorders, evolving treatments, and new technologies. The way to deal with the rapid pace of change is to ensure that clinicians are developing adaptive expertise. Adaptability is critical as clinical practice requires constant adaptation. The challenge to developing this adaptive expertise among our students and novice clinicians is that the clinical environment is often chaotic and stressful, with intense demands and scarce learning data. A long list of challenges gets in the way of effectively supporting our learners as they develop adaptive expertise. Because the learning environment is inherently challenging, we need to give students access to information that empowers them to develop adaptive expertise without the constant support of educators. That encourages self-regulated learning. To do this, we must adapt our teaching methods so that students are increasingly empowered to self-assess, plan their learning, and evaluate their progress. We need a process where educators support goal setting as a coach rather than a mentor. Students need information and tools to develop adaptive expertise and self-regulated learning. This brings me back to the concept of the master adaptive learner. I mentioned it earlier in the context of adaptive expertise. Many of you are familiar with the idea. It's a learning process that aims to develop expertise through self-regulated learning. I'm not going to delve into details here, but I encourage you to check this book out. What I think is important to point out is that in the first phase called planning, during this phase, it's essential to clearly articulate the gap between what is and what could not be or should be. This gap can be related to knowledge, skills, or attitudes, and should be seen as an opportunity for improvement. During the planning phase, the learner must also select the appropriate resources to address that gap. This is important because this is what accelerates students as self-regulated learners. In other words, to launch self-regulated learners, we need to know where to start and use reasonable efficiency and expertise in picking aligned resources. To launch self-regulated learning, students need feedback on strengths and weaknesses. As Bill Cutrer noted, assessment data helps identify gaps. Formative assessment provides low-stakes feedback that the students can use to understand gaps and prompt their thinking. By revealing gaps, formative assessment encourages self-regulated learning and the development of adaptive expertise. Having explored these crucial pitfalls and the importance of formative assessment in nurturing self-regulated learning, I will now pass the discussion back to Joe, who will delve into how Calibrate serves as a formative assessment.
Thank you, Nicole, for that comprehensive analysis of the pitfalls in formative assessment. And I guess reinforcing the pivotal role of fostering self-directed learning, I think about adaptive expertise a lot, not just in the world of clinicians, but in the world of students in general. Since I have an undergraduate college student now, and I'm thinking about whether he's getting this opportunity to develop this adaptive expertise. But I'm going to build on these points, and I'm going to explore how Calibrate effectively encourages self-directed learning, because that was really what we set out to do. The tool is designed to overcome these identified pitfalls. And before I describe Calibrate, I want to return to Aquifer's goal of building this holistic learning system. And the two big circles, Calibrate is one of those. It's the formative assessment portion. It's designed to help students see their strengths. And this is really important. We believe that students should be able to see their strengths and their gaps so that they can launch into this master adaptive learner process, a process that they own. And the cases, the content that most of you on this call are familiar with, the pediatrics cases, the trauma-informed care cases, These are what are intended to be those learning resources that Nicole mentioned. So in terms of like seeing your gaps and efficiently and effectively picking resources that can fill those, that's the relationship between those two. So formative assessment has been shown to have impact on learning. And for that to happen, we just need to avoid these pitfalls, that's it, when using it, or we undermine its effectiveness. One of the important impacts that formative assessment can have is to provide students with this useful information. So it's this starting point that is mentioned as in the planning session. It's that external data that gets you started. And you're started towards developing this adaptive expertise. So I'm going to talk briefly about Calibrate in general, and then I'm going to give the student view of the results. I also want to note that I think I can drop into the chat here. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. I dropped into the chat a link to my calendar. So if you're interested after this in a more comprehensive demo around the administrative reports or how to launch an assessment or just a deeper chat with you and your team, you can schedule time directly onto my calendar. I'm also later on going to provide a link for you to take a demo assessment, an 8-question demo assessment, so you can sign up for that. And we'll get you enrolled in that. But the brief overview is really important because it was intentionally designed as formative assessment. So it was designed to be assessment for learning, not of learning, so not as a summative assessment. It works with Aquifer's cases directly. So the cases are meant to cover the national curriculum. So for example, in pediatrics, cover the ComSet curriculum. The assessment is meant to align with that curriculum and those cases. So work together, not meant to be used to rank or grade students. And it's really interesting, Nicole sort of slid this in earlier, but the system is called Calibrate, and she used it as a verb because that's the way we think about it. The system is called Calibrate because the purpose is to help students calibrate their competence, or to ensure that the gap between perceived and actual competence is narrow enough. So we don't want these cases where there's a really wide gap between what students think they know and what they actually know. This is where students believe they are more prepared for clinical care than they really are. We know that this turns out to be the most dangerous gap for our patients, and we must help our learners identify and close these gaps wherever possible. It's really interesting on the assessment, which I didn't mention on the previous slide, but the students take a very similar assessment. It's got a vignette, there's a single best answer, but they also note their certainty, and it goes from very certain down to very uncertain. And I happen to have looked at a student this morning because one of my colleagues sent it and said, this is actually turns out to be a fairly common distribution of data. And it was a student who had answered every single question as very uncertain or uncertain. But what was fascinating about this student was it was an early assessment before her family medicine rotation, and she had answered 75% of the questions correctly. But she had answered that she was uncertain. And so in that case, she needed to calibrate that she actually did know some things, and reinforcing that turns out to be an important part of this process as well. And the way we designed this was to allow students to take 2 assessments. So when we talk about it as formative, we think of it as an early assessment that a student can take at the beginning of the rotation. They can find out where they are at the start, and then they can also take one at the end, maybe a week before, that lets them know how much they moved and gives them some ideas of how to prep before that final exam, whatever that summative exam is that they're going to take. So the early exam is designed, the early Calibrate is designed to support in rotation learning to help those students be a bit more proficient. And the late exam is to give them an update of where they are and maybe help them prepare for their future learning or the final exam. And again, this is all aligned or designed to be aligned with the national curriculum, so the questions come straight from what the cases are teaching. And so the idea in this is then that the process starts with the initial assessment. We recommend 2 weeks minimum between the 2 assessments, and to try to do the assessment kind of early in their clerkship rotation or clinical rotation. So students actively engage in this targeted learning. So they start by taking the exam, and then they can create their own plan, preferably with the support of a coach. So they look at the results, they create a plan, and then they follow that plan during the rotation and then take another late exam at the end. By design, then, Calibrate acts as an assessment for learning, avoiding these pitfalls, and it aims to empower the learner through this self-evaluation process and reflection. And we actually have built in a learning plan into our system so the student can take the assessment, analyze their data, and build a plan that they can share with their preceptor or coach. The assessment is, they vary. We have assessments in radiology, pediatrics, internal medicine, and family medicine. Internal medicine and family medicine take the longest, just under an hour for both the early and the late is what we're seeing in the data right now. Radiology is the shortest, under 20 minutes, and pediatrics is about 45 minutes, both early and late. Every assessment has 5 unscored questions on it just to get us through the validation process. They're easy to administer. You set them up. It sends an email out to the students. You can set a window as long as 10 days. It sends an email. It's meant to be unproctored. And we have had psychometric analysis of the assessments, and they're found to be valid and reliable, if that's crossing anyone's mind. I mentioned this earlier, but again, the questions are written by a team of clinicians. They're validated, and then they follow this board style approach. So you have a short vignette, single best answer. And then the students also identify their certainty. And we think this adds this really important component. And I know many of you are seeing this in your exams now that your recertification exams, you're starting to see this, like how certain you are. I did a CPR assessment where I had to do this. I had to take a class and I had to answer all these questions as I went along, and I had to say how certain I was about my answers and what I knew. So it's becoming a much more common practice, and we think it adds an important piece of information for the students. So I'm not going to get too deep into this, but each item on the assessment is given what we call a CLC, or clinical learning calibration. It ranges from warning. In that case, it means that the student missed the question and they were very certain they knew it. So in those cases, that's that warning area where we're worried about our students, versus all the way up to the 2 green ones on the upper right-hand side, which means that the student got the question correct and they sort of knew they were going to get it correct. They were very certain or certain about it. It also takes into consideration efficiency. So are the students sitting on the question for a long time? And that's largely being compared to other students like them. So students early in the clerkship taking an early assessment are compared to other early students. Students late in the clerkship are being compared to other students who took the late exam. As soon as a student completes the exam, they receive an email. Their results also show up on the screen, but they receive an email saying your results are ready, and then they can go to a results interface. And I'm going to show you really quickly. I see that it's 1:43. So I'm going to give you an overview of what the student sees here. And I'm going to switch this, and I'm going to show you a tab here. And this is, so when a student gets their results, this is what their results looks like. The results page looks like. It's a 4 tabs. So for an early assessment, you have 4 tabs. For a late assessment, you actually have 5 tabs, because you get a tab that allows you to compare the early and the late results, which is pretty cool. I'm not going to show it today, but if you have students who are taking an early assessment and then a late assessment, they get to see where their growth was, how much they grew, and in which areas of the assessment they grew. So that's a pretty nifty part too. But in this case, the student this is an early assessment. This is an example student. Somebody who took the assessment. This is also going to be a mixed assessment. So items from radiology, pediatrics, family medicine, and internal medicine, because it was used as a demo. And in here, what you get is the overall. The student gets the overall for starters. And in here, you can see their overall performance. They're being compared to other like students, so peers, early in the assessment. And then they're also being told down here about their accuracy, how certain they were. And this is a calibration of their certainty. Were they certain when they got things correct, and sort of uncertain when they got things incorrect? Did they sort of know what they knew and know what they didn't know? And then efficiency is really that comparison of how efficiently they're answering questions as they go through it. The student also gets like a little more detail here by those what I called CLC categories earlier, which is these different categories that you break things into. And so for each one of these questions, what you can see here is each one of these categories. I'm sorry, this is a novice category, and what you can see, I'm going to bump this up a little bit. This is a case where the student was wrong, but they were also uncertain. So they knew they didn't know this. They get a little bit of information about the question that they were asked. Describe options for imaging abdominal pain in a pregnant patient. They get the answer explanation, which is if they knew this concept, they would have been able to answer the question correctly. And this comes directly out of the case. We call it a teaching point. They get the clinical focus, the system, and then whether when they took the question that they had completed the case. In this case, the student had not completed the case. And so this one they can add directly to a to-do list, and this student already has added it to a to-do list because it says view to-do. This one down here they could add. So what the student has the option to do now is to look through these test results, this formative assessment, and say, you know what, that's probably something that's going to be really important to me, and is something I want to prioritize, and they can add this directly to a to-do list. So the students now in Aqueduct, when they log in, they get a to-do list that their faculty assigns to them if they do that, and a to-do list that they can assign to themselves. And in about 3 weeks, we have a new interface coming out that's really slick in how it presents it to the students. So this is that view there. And then the student also has this option up here where they can filter, and they can start to filter by like questions they got right or wrong, how certain they were. They can look at only their uncertain questions or only their, in this case, certain questions. They can look by clinical focus, whether they only want to look at questions about diagnosis or management or prevention. System, any of the systems that we have here, nervous system, they could only pull those questions out if they want. So they can start to look at patterns. But what we think is ultimately the thing that we're really thinking hard about and trying to get students to adopt, is this learning plan portion, where you can start to add these items to your to-do list, and you can add comments to them, but you can also fill out observations. Like, this is what I want to work on during this clinical period. So I've done the planning, I've taken the assessment, I've looked at the results, I've added some things to my list, and now I'm going to share this with somebody. And so we have this share button here, and they can share this directly with you as their preceptor, their coach, their clerkship director. They can say, okay, here it is. And I talked to one PA rotation director who said that the way she uses this is very similar to what Nicole mentioned earlier, which is a presence absence, that the students actually have to go through and fill out their learning plan, but they're not graded on the learning plan. They're really just given a pass fail on this. Did you do it? Didn't you do it? Did you put some effort into it? So it's not a question of how they performed on the assessment. And so when you get into this, yes. So I see there's a question actually in the Q&A, which if I were going to show you the interface, one of the things that we, for program faculty, and if you want, I'm happy to set up a meeting with you, Randy, at another time, but to show you the interface. But it actually, what we have is you can take a group of students. So if you have 15 students in a clerkship, or you can mix multiple clerkships together, so you can add each clerkship throughout a year. And then you can look, we have a graph that shows by learning objective how those students performed, and you can sort that graph so you can start to see gaps in the curriculum. And one of the programs that is using Aquifer right now, it's a family medicine clerkship, and they require students to do 8 cases, which are decided by the clerkship, and then the students select 4 of their own. So what they're doing right now is having the students use Calibrate to select the cases that they're going to do. But then the clerkship itself is going to change the 8 cases following this year based on how the students are performing on Calibrate. So they're going to go back and look at the summary results and say, okay, we probably don't need these 2 cases as part of the required. We can put in these 2 other cases. So they're going to use it for that purpose of analyzing their curriculum. All right, so I'm going to step back in, and after that brief overview, and we're just going to go back before we bring Nicole on here to ask her the hard questions that I know you started to prepare. So I just want to do just again say thank you for your time. Thanks for coming and joining us today to have this conversation. I'm going to drop in the chat, once I open up the Q&A, the option to take a demo assessment. And also you have my calendar invite there too. You can add time to my calendar and we can chat. But in summary, I just want to say that formative assessment is known to promote self-directed learning when the pitfalls that Nicole described are avoided. And this develops adaptive expertise. Calibrate was specifically designed to empower students through self-evaluation and targeted learning plans. By pairing formative assessment with coaching, we believe that we can really accelerate learning. And next two webinars are about coaching with Calibrate. And then, so the next session is about coaching specifically. The one after that is about using some of the tools that we have for coaches with Calibrate. And we believe that together with coaching, formative assessment, and cases, we can initiate a cycle of continuous improvement that empowers this adaptability and independence for our students. So given that, I'm going to move into the Q&A. And I don't know if you are seeing any questions. I saw the one pop up, Megan, but I haven't seen any other ones in the chat. But feel free to drop your questions in the chat or into the Q&A. And I'm going to kick it off because this is the question that we almost always get whenever I talk to people about Calibrate, which is, this is for Nicole, since you have the experience with this, do students buy into taking Calibrate twice during a rotation?
Well, it's all about the way it gets framed, right, to the student. The students already, during clerkships and clinical rotations, they're studying for their end of rotation exams and things like that. And I think that one way to foster buy-in is that it's going to help them to identify those knowledge gaps. I have talked to several other faculty members at other programs that have used this, and we've talked about the difference between making it required or optional. When I've used it in my program, it was a required assignment. So it's pretty easy to get buy-in when you're required to do it as part of your rotation related assignments. But I do think that sometimes faculty will have an issue getting students to buy into it when they are given the option to use it. So I think that if you decide not to require it, it's all about framing it in a way that you can show them. And I think that doing some of that coaching can be really helpful in getting that buy-in from the students, especially if you're able to use it for multiple rotations. So you introduce it during family medicine, they realize how much it helped them, then you can kind of pull it into some of these other rotation specialties.
Yeah, that's important. It's one of your colleagues mentioned to me that she hadn't gotten a lot of pushback on it, which surprised her. She made it required but not graded, and so she thought that was important. And then Corky Lehman from Cincinnati was saying last week that she did not make hers required, and they're switching right now to required because they felt like there was value in it, not grading it, but making sure that the students took it. So I see that there's a question about, let's see, is it possible to pull questions across categories? So the assessments are not, we can't edit the assessments, or you can't edit the assessment as a user. The assessments are designed to align with the course curriculum. So pediatrics assessments are designed to align with the concept curriculum, and we don't have the ability right now for you to create assessments, just say cardiology or pulmonology or just system specific. Being released this summer is that the students will have access to a self-assessment question bank. So it'll be a question bank that'll be aligned with the learning objectives in Aquifer, and they will have the ability to build those assessments, but we don't have that. We won't have that ability for program directors. Is there a way to see a check mark if a student completes a study plan, or do they have to send it to us to see that it was done? Yeah, so it depends. So in your case, if the student, as part of their study plan, say like the one that I showed you had several cases on there, you can monitor case completion within your reports in Aqueduct. So if the student said, I'm going to do these 5 cases, you can absolutely see if they've done those things. If the student has some other set of objectives or actions they're going to take, they would have to report on that to you. Any other questions coming through? So we're down to the last couple minutes here. And I want to say, thank you for your time today. I put my email, I believe. Yes, I put my email into the chat. I put my Calendly link in somewhere, and I think Megan will probably follow up with those in her follow-up email with the video from today, and then also the form to request to get the demo assessment. And just so you know, the demo assessment, I believe, is 8 questions long, and it links to various cases. But it gives you a good picture of what it looks like and allows you to see what the student interface is like with the data afterwards. So thank you very much. If there aren't any other questions, we really appreciate your time, and I look forward to hearing from you.